Haven Arrest Missionary Baptist Church presents Union Gospel Presses Sunday School Lesson number 10, Sunday, August 9th, 2020. The lesson is entitled David against Goliath. Lesson text comes from 1 Samuel chapter 17, verses 40 through 51. Related scriptures are 1 Samuel 17, 1 through 58, 1 Corinthians 1, 26 through 31, Psalms 18, 30 through 41, and 44, 1 through 8. The place is the Valley of Elah. The time is around 1023 BC. Have you ever faced a situation that you felt was too difficult for you to handle? It is pretty safe to say that most of us, if not all of us, have been there. We go through circumstances that are scary and the odds seem stacked against us. It is in these times that we must trust the Lord to work in us. It is in these times when He shows that nothing is too great for Him. As God helps us in times of hardship, we learn more and more that He is worthy of our absolute trust and obedience. In this week's lesson, we find Israel staring into the face of a giant. This man had the entire Israelite army afraid to fight him. No one, including King Saul, dared to take on the great Philistine champion. That is, until a young man stepped up and accepted the challenge to take down the massive giant in order to give praise and glory to God. You do not have to be great in order to do great things for God. You have to trust Him to do great things through you. Today's aim, facts. To know that there are no limits to what God can do through those who trust Him completely. Principle, to see that faith is a necessary component to living a victorious life in Christ. Application, to be confident that God can defeat the giants in our lives if we trust Him to work on our behalf. Illustrating the lesson. Even the biggest giants fall at the feet of a person who trusts God to help him in times of distress. Practical points. 1. Our faith and the simple objects we dedicate to God will accomplish His divine purpose. 1 Samuel 17:40. 2. People of faith should not be intimidated by the size of their problems. Verses 41 through 42. 3. Our faith in God is tested when the unsaved mock and threaten. Verses 43 through 44. 4. When we know that we are on God's side, we can speak boldly to our critics. Verses 45 through 47. 5. God will deliver whom He pleases Him to deliver, and we can trust Him completely. Verses 48 through 49. 6. God empowers believers to slay the giants in their lives. Verses 50 through 51. Golden text. Then said David to the Philistine, Thou comest to me with the sword, and with the spear, and with the shield. But I come to thee in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel, whom thou hast defiled. 1 Samuel 17:45. Today we have 3 lesson outlines. The first is David's courage and preparation. 1 Samuel 17:40 through 41. The second is David's confidence and declaration. 1 Samuel 17:42 through 47. And the third is David's victorious conquest. 1 Samuel 17:48 through 51. Introduction. If you grew up going to Sunday school and church, you certainly heard the story of David and Goliath. Even those with little biblical knowledge are often familiar with this account from the life of ancient Israel's greatest king. We are all attracted to stories of people or groups who are triumphant over seemingly superior foes. Perhaps this is because we often see ourselves as underdogs. Moreover, if we have any sense of compassion and justice, we realize that many of the little people of the world are often subjected to tyrants who abuse them, both physically and emotionally. Therefore, we usually rejoice when the bad guy gets his just desserts. God frequently works through people who otherwise might be overlooked. Take Paul as an example. Who would have thought that God could take this persecutor of the faith and turn him into a great preacher of the gospel in the early church? Initially, some actually doubted his conversion, Acts 9:26. If God could use a shepherd boy like David or a persecutor like Paul, he can use us. David's courage and preparation. 1 Samuel 17:40. And he took his staff in his hand and chose him 5 smooth stones out of the brook and put them in a shepherd's bag, which he had, even in a scrip. And his sling was in his hand, and he drew near to the Philistine. Verse 41. And the Philistine came on and drew near unto David, and the man that bare the shield went before him. Because of King Saul's presumptuous disobedience, God declared that his kingdom would not last, and that a man after his own heart, 13:14, would be chosen as his successor. As we know, that man was David, who at this time was a youth, probably still in his teens. Though anointed to be the new king, 16:10-13, David would not actually be crowned until a number of years later. First, over his own tribe of Judah, 2 Samuel 2:1-4, and then over all Israel, 5:1-5. As 1 Samuel 17 opens, Israel was again facing their old arch enemies, the Philistines. There was something of a standoff between the two armies, each facing off at the valley of Elah, about 17 miles southwest of Jerusalem. Challenging the Israelites each day was the Philistine champion, a giant from Gath named Goliath. Goliath is described as being more than 9 feet tall, wearing heavy armor and carrying a huge spear. 1 Samuel 17:4-7. No one in Saul's army was a match for this giant. No one was willing to accept Goliath's offer to engage him directly, even with the promise that the entire Philistine army would submit to slavery if someone could prevail over their champion. Verses 8-10. David's 3 older brothers were in Saul's army, and their father sent David to check on them. Arriving at the battlefront, David learned of Goliath's daily challenge. As far as David was concerned, Goliath was not only challenging Israel's army, but Israel's God as well. 1 Samuel 17:26. When David began to show interest in taking on Goliath, his older brothers saw this as idle boasting and questioned his motives for even being there. Verse 28. Hearing that someone was willing to fight Goliath, Saul summoned David. But after seeing him, Saul concluded that David was no match for the giant. David informed the king that he had killed both a lion and a bear and was confident the Lord would enable him to similarly defeat the giant. 1 Samuel 17:37. So Saul dressed David in the typical armor of the day, likely concluding the shepherd boy needed all the help he could get. But David was not trained in its use and found the armor too cumbersome. Instead, David took with him what he was used to, his staff and sling, and made his way to the brook. There he selected 5 smooth stones and put them into his shepherd's bag. The word scrip, 1 Samuel 17:40, means a pouch and is simply another name for the bag. While some have suggested some spiritual meaning to the 5 stones, nothing is said concerning why David selected 5 of them. Perhaps this was the number of stones he figured he could hurl at the giant in the time he had when approaching him, or maybe this was simply the number of stones that would fit in his bag. Obviously, smooth stones would travel farther and faster than others, which is why they were selected. The sling should not be confused with the modern slingshot. The ancient sling was usually a long piece of leather or cloth with a stone placed in a pocket in the middle. It was slung round and round in the air, and then then one end of the sling was released, allowing the stone to hurtle toward its target. In addition to being heavily armed, Goliath also had an armor bearer who carried a shield in front of him to protect the giant from flying arrows. David's confidence and declaration. Verse 42. And when the Philistine looked about and saw David, he disdained him, for he was but a youth and ruddy and of a fair countenance. Verse 43. And the Philistine said unto David, Am I a dog that thou comest to me with staffs? And the Philistine cursed David by his gods. Verse 44. And the Philistine said to David, Come to me, and I will give thy flesh unto the fowls of the air and to the beasts of the field. Verse 45. Then David said to the Philistine, Thou comest to me with the sword and with the spear and with a shield, but I come to thee in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel, whom thou hast defiled. Verse 46. This day will the Lord deliver thee into mine hand, and I will smite thee, and take thine head from thee, and I will give the carcasses of the host of the Philistines this day unto the fowls of the air, and to the wild beasts of the earth, that all the earth may know that there is a God in Israel. Verse 47. And all this assembly shall know that the Lord saveth not with sword and spear, for the battle is the Lord's, and he will give you into our hands. Goliath's disdain. 1 Samuel 17, 42 through 45. Being the giant and man of war that he was, Goliath felt insulted that a mere youth was being sent out to engage him in battle. The Hebrew word rendered youth gives no clear indication of David's age at this time, as it was usually broadly of boys, young men, and servants. Because of what we may have been taught as children, we might envision David as a small boy, but that is very unlikely from what we know of his exploits thus far. From Goliath's perspective, though, David would no doubt have appeared to him as a mere boy. David was ruddy. Verse 42. That is, his face had a healthy red color. A fair countenance could be understood as handsome. Not at all impressed with David's physical appearance, Goliath disdained him. Winning a contest against a cruddily armed underage challenger would not be particularly prestigious for the Philistine giant. Responding to what he saw before him, Goliath felt as though he were being treated like a dog rather than the mighty warrior he was. Staves, 1 Samuel 17:43, were sticks such as those that might be used to shoo off dogs. Since David carried his staff into battle, verse 40, Goliath was probably referring to that in his comment. Goliath also petitioned his false gods to visit curses on the young man approaching him. In order to make the most of the contest, however, Goliath became a psychological assault. Unimpressed by the young warrior headed toward him, the giant was certain he would be victorious. Goliath invited David to engage him in battle and taunted him, declaring that before long he would lie lifeless on the valley floor, becoming food for the vultures and vermin. Such confidence on the part of Goliath likely made it possible for David to get close enough to get a good shot at the giant. Goliath was certainly an example of Proverbs 16:18. Pride goeth before destruction, and an haughty spirit before a fall. David's declaration, 1 Samuel 17:45 through 47. David's confidence was not just in his ability with the sling, a weapon he no doubt had used many times in protecting his flock. David's trust was in the Lord. To come in the name of the Lord was to come in his strength and power. Just as your name stands for you, so the Lord's name stands for him. In proclaiming the Lord's name, David was invoking God's promise to protect those who trust in him, a blessing that David considered a mighty arraignment in the face of Goliath's mere bronze and iron. While King Saul may have been the earthly head of Israel's army, the men drawn up in battle against the Philistines were in fact under the Lord of hosts. Verse 45. The expression is synonymous with God of the armies. Goliath disdained, verse 42, David, but the giant had actually defiled, verse 45, Israel's God by his words. This was no ordinary battle, but one in which God's honor was at stake. And in this circumstance, David's exposure to danger permitted God's honor to be more clearly acknowledged than if David had more obviously been a match for the Philistine. At no point did David take any credit for the successful outcome, which he confidently expected. David's confidence in the Lord was so great that he knew he would be victorious over the giant that very day. While it is not stated, it is apparent that David's strong faith was the basis of his confidence. As Jonathan said before an earlier battle with the Philistines, it may be that the Lord will work for us, for there is no restraint to the Lord to save by many or by few. 14:6. Goliath assumed young David would be easy prey and had spoken confidently of what he would do to him. David responded in similar fashion. He declared that not only would he prevail, but he would also sever the head of the giant from his body. Furthermore, he said that after Goliath's defeat, the Philistine army would be routed and their bodies would become food for the birds and beasts. The ultimate purpose of these events was not to bring glory to David. Rather, it was that all the earth may know that there is a God in Israel. 1 Samuel 17:46. Indeed, all would know that the battle is the Lord's. Verse 47. And the Lord does not require sword and spear to gain the victory. As Christians, we must guard against the tendencies to trust in our own efforts and ingenuity. For the most part, our battles are spiritual in nature. As Paul put it, the weapons of our warfare are not carnal. 2 Corinthians 10:4. Our armor is that which God himself supplies. Ephesians 6:10-17. The only way we can defeat the devil is by using the same weapon Christ used in his temptations. Matthew 4:1-11. Namely, the sword of the Spirit, which is the word of God. Ephesians 6:17. This, however, should not be taken to mean that we can be passive in our battles, spiritual or otherwise. David trusted God and gave credit to him for the victory, but he still had to engage the enemy and use the weapons he had at his disposal. This is a balanced approach, as seen in James' discussion of the importance of both faith and works. James 2:14-16. David's victorious conquest. Verse 48. And it came to pass when the Philistine arose and came and drew nigh to meet David, that David hastened and ran toward the army to meet the Philistine. Verse 49. And David put his hand in his bag and took thence a stone and slang it and smote the Philistine in his forehead, that the stone shrunk into his forehead, and he fell upon his face to the earth. Verse 50. So David prevailed over the Philistine with a sling and with a stone, and smote the Philistine and slew him. But there was no sword in the hand of David. Verse 51. Therefore David ran and stood upon the Philistine and took his sword and drew it out of the sheath, therefore, and slew him and cut off his head therewith. And when the Philistines saw their companion was dead, they fled. The combat. 1 Samuel 17:48-49. If Goliath was typical of a person of great stature, he probably moved slowly. Being both a big target and possibly a slow-moving one, this would be advantageous to David's plan for victory. David, on the other hand, hastened. 1 Samuel 17:48. That is, he ran quickly to meet his foe. We can easily visualize the scene before us. The two armies are standing on opposite hillsides, watching and waiting to see the outcome of what was playing out before their eyes. As David ran toward the giant, he quickly fetched one of the stones he had in his pouch, placing it in his sling. He let it fly toward the giant. The stone could not have hit the giant in a more vulnerable spot. As we might say, Goliath was hit right between the eyes, probably one of the few spots unprotected by his armor. The stone struck Goliath with such force that it sunk into his forehead, verse 49. In short, the stone was hurled with such velocity that Goliath was not merely grazed but disabled. It has been estimated that the stone was about the size of a tennis ball and would have been traveling at about 100 miles per hour. While we might assume that the stone killed the giant, apparently it did not. He nevertheless fell face forward to the earth, undoubtedly with a giant thud. Since the extent of his injury is not stated, we cannot say whether he would have been able to recover, possibly even continue to fight. The conclusion, 1 Samuel 17:50 through 51. While slings were used in ancient warfare, they apparently were not typically the weapons of choice. More common were swords, spears, and arrows. This makes it even more amazing that David was able to prevail over Goliath with a sling and with a stone. Before Goliath could regain consciousness, if indeed he was able to, David ran and stood upon the fallen giant. Wasting no time, David unsheathed Goliath's sword and thrust him through. As promised, David cut off the giant's head. All this would have added insult to injury in the presence of the Philistine army. Since their companion was dead, the Philistines made an immediate retreat. Not letting this opportunity slip away, Saul's army pursued them a great distance and was victorious over them. 1 Samuel 17:52. David took the head of Goliath to Jerusalem. Verse 54, no doubt as a trophy for all to see. This was a victory not only for David, but also for the whole nation. Once Saul realized what a valuable asset David was to the army, he did not allow David to return home. 1 Samuel 18:2. He made David a commander in the army, and David quickly became the hero of the people. Verse 5. Because everyone was lauding the success of the young officer, verses 6 through 7, Saul became jealous and began to fear David as a threat to his throne. This sets the stage for next week's lesson, when Saul's paranoia led him to try to murder young David. Rather than rejoicing that such a capable young man was now in his army, Saul could only think evil things about the man who became the husband of his daughter and the best friend of his son. Sadly, jealousy still controls many people today. Questions. 1. Who was Goliath, and what challenge did he present to the Israelites? 2. How did David initially end up on the battlefield? 3. What weapons did David take with him into the battle? 4. What was a sling and how was it used? 5. What does the Bible say about David's physical appearance? 6. How did Goliath respond when he saw David? 7. In what manner did David approach the giant? 8. Why do you think David was so confident of victory? 9. What happened when Goliath was hit with the stone? 10. How did the Philistine army react to David's triumph over Goliath? This concludes the Sunday School lesson for Sunday, August 9, 2020. Thank you for listening. God bless.